Good morning everyone, how's it going today? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video we're going to be taking a look at GPT-5 and everything that you did not see in the presentation. And actually I'm going to show you exactly what has changed in the API, because a few things have changed, and I'm going to show you how to use those new features to actually make the most out of GPT-5. We're going to take a look at what actually GPT-5 is. So a system of models, not a single model. I'm going to show you a very quick test that you can do to see if you actually prefer GPT-5 over 4o, and you can tell me what your results were in the comments below. We're also going to take a look at the pricing and how it is actually a bit less transparent, a bit more tricky than you would expect from this page right here. We're going to go into more detail about that. And lastly, of course, we're going to go over the notebook, exploring the reasoning capabilities and the reasoning chain of thought of GPT-5. And in the end, we're also going to take a little bit of time talking about the security aspects of GPT-5, because there's quite new, fairly new developments on that side. And I think that the competitors are actually going to implement some of these features, including the multi-model system and the security aspects behind the chain of thought monitoring. Yeah, without any further ado, oh yeah, by the way, every single thing that I'm going to be citing right here is in the description, including the notebook and every article that I'm going to talk about right here. So yeah, let's get right into it. All right, so the first thing to consider is that this is actually not a model, okay? So we have been told that GPT-5 was released, and however, we're not getting just one model, we're getting a set of models. However, we're not getting access to every single one of them. We're getting access to a system that routes us to the model that the API or the service deems necessary to respond to our query. So let's take a look at what this actually means. So they say GPT-5 is a unified system with a smart and fast model that answers most questions, a deeper reasoning model for harder problems, a real-time router that quickly decides which model to use based on conversation type, complexity, tool needs, and explicit intent. So for example, if you say that you want your model to think hard about a prompt, it is going to think harder about it. And we're going to see that actually in just a moment when I show you the actual demo in the notebook. But as you can see, we don't have only one model. We have 6 different models: GPT-5, GPT-5 Main Mini, 5 Thinking, Thinking Mini, Thinking Nano, and Thinking Pro. And all of this are going to be behind this router that is going to decide which model our request is routed to. And that is not an optional thing. We are going to have this router not only in ChatGPT, but also in the API. And I think that this is actually something that is going to change the way that we deal with these LLM providers, because the reason for this is most likely to reduce costs. They most have the data to back the fact that most of the queries that they get sent to the larger models could actually be answered by smaller models. So that is probably the reason why they're doing this. That also allows them to provide this system for a way lower price. Although we're going to take a look at the price in just a moment to see that it's not as low as they seem to say it is. But yeah, I think this is definitely a great move. However, it's not very transparent. And since the reason why I say this is that here you can see that there are really 6 models behind the scenes. But actually, when you take a look at the API, there are 3 different models. So there's not only one interface that routes to any of the 6 models. There are 3 different interfaces that route to the to I don't know which model. So I mean, so we have GPT-5, GPT-5 Mini, and GPT-5 Nano, and those are the 3 main interfaces for the API, right? In ChatGPT, you only get one. You get GPT-5, and that routes to any of the 6. But on the API, you have these 3 different interfaces, and I don't see a way to predict which models are going to be routed. I mean, which API endpoints are going to be routed to which of these models. They are the ones to decide. And to me, that's quite alarming because the prices are very different. So GPT-5 Mini is 25 cents and $2 input output. Nano is 0.5 and 4 cents. And then GPT-5 is $1.25 and $10 per million tokens. I think that's a bit obscure. However, that being said, Sam Altman has come out in the last few hours saying that they will try to make it more transparent about which model is actually answering to your query so that you're better able to track this. And yeah, I mean, in general, just something to keep in mind. This is probably the way that we're going to be seeing LLMs in the future. However, I do think that we're going to get more transparent interfaces about this. That being said, I'm pretty sure that this model is actually better than GPT-4o. And as they have shown in their benchmarks, if you want to check out the actual benchmarks, probably watch the actual short introductory video that they have. It's not very long, and they all talk all about the benchmarks. But right here, I want to talk to you about actually how to use it and what has changed. So something interesting about this is that Sam Altman shared this test by this guy called Flowerslop, and it's essentially just an experiment where you get a bunch of questions and you have to decide which one you like the most. One of them too is answered by GPT-4o, the other one is by GPT-5, and you decide which one you prefer of the two. And then by the end, you get an answer of how many times out of the total number of questions you chose GPT-5 over GPT-4o. And I tested this really quickly with 10 questions that I actually ran. I mean, I selected GPT-5 10 out of 10 times. So, I mean, to me, it seems like GPT-5 does seem to be giving better answers, apparently. That being said, it's still a bit obscure which model actually answered the queries that I had. But there you go. That is for the models and the a bit lack of transparency about that. I'm sure that we're going to get better transparency on that side soon. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the pricing right here. And on paper, actually, GPT-5 seems to be extremely affordable. As we mentioned before, probably the reason for this is that they are capable of routing simple queries to very affordable models, so they can lower the cost for everyone while keeping the power users at a pretty okay cost. The problem here is still what I mentioned before, the transparency, because you don't know which model is actually answering your query. But if you don't consider that, this is still a great price for a model or a system of models that behaves as good as this one in the benchmarks. So you probably definitely want to use this one if you feel that it can help you. It is even more affordable than GPT-4o, and it's about the same price as 4.1, and it is exactly the same price, at least on paper, to to Gemini 2.5 Pro. That being said, this is on paper. And I say that because actually GPT-5 is a reasoning model by default, okay? There is a way to manage how much it is going to reason, but it is a reasoning model by default. And that can make the pricing a little bit less transparent. So actually, this tweet by Jerry Liu is very telling about this. In case you're not familiar with Jerry, Jerry's the founder of Lame Index, and they specialize in agentic frameworks, but they also have a very big part of their business, which is parsing of unstructured data, such as images and documents. And what you see right here is them testing GPT-5 to use for the parsing of PDF files, images, etc. And they say right here that in a work in progress preliminary finding is that even though on paper GPT-5 is $1.25 dollars per million tokens, it actually uses 4 to 5 more tokens than GPT-4.1, making it quite a bit more expensive than GPT-4.1. They said, we fed the exact same document image and prompt into all the models, and presumably GPT-5 uses a lot more verbose thinking tokens in order to reason over images, or they probably changed the tokenizer, we don't know. But this seems to be the case. So GPT-5 is still a bit not very transparent on their pricing. And let me tell you more about that, because this is actually very interesting. What's going on in the reasoning part is that reasoning models like GPT-5 are LLMs trained with reinforcement learning to perform reasoning. Reasoning, think before the answer, producing a long internal chain of thought before responding to the user. The reasoning tokens are very good for complicated stuff and etc. But something to keep in mind is that these guys, they actually introduce reasoning tokens in addition to input and output tokens. And these guys right here are billed as output tokens themselves, okay? So even if you don't see the reasoning tokens that they use to decide what it's going to answer to you, you are being charged for them. And you do not have access to the reasoning tokens themselves. So that can be kind of a tricky thing to get around or to get used to it. They say that after the reasoning tokens are generated, the model produces an answer as visible completion tokens and discards the reasoning tokens from its context. So you don't see those reasoning tokens, but you are charged for them. And you do, however, have access to the summary of the chain of thought of all of those reasoning tokens. So if you pass the summary parameter to your API call, you will see those reasoning the summary of what it thought about. I'm going to show you how that works in just a moment with a notebook that I have right here. But yeah, it's a bit tricky thing to get used to. But there you go. Just keep that in mind. And something very, very important, as I'm going to show you in just a moment in the notebook, you probably want to start using the Responses API instead of the chat completion, because, of course, GPT-5 is always a reasoning model, or at least almost always, as you can see right here. Faster models are less expensive per token, and they think a little bit less as well. So let me show you what that looks like in the actual code. So let's get right into that. So now that we have understood the new parts of ChatGPT and GPT-5, let's talk about the new features in the GPT-5 API, because it is going to be changing a few things. And if the other LLM providers actually follow along with these changes that these guys are implementing, we're going to be seeing a very important shift in the way that we are getting access to these LLMs. So here I have a notebook where I show you exactly what I mean by this. So what I did is I just initialized my API key. I'm using the latest OpenAI. I'm just pinned it right here so that you know that this notebook's always working. And in this example, we're going to be taking a look at the new parameter that they're implementing to the API, and it's called the Verbosity Param. Okay. So previously, every completion was set to medium for all queries. Now you have the ability to select how verbose your answer is supposed to be. So the answer can be either low, medium, or high. And as you can see right here, I am actually benchmarking, well, not just comparing the answer for Are You Conscious with low, medium, and high verbosity. Okay. So on low verbosity, it said, no, I don't have consciousness or subjective experiences. I generate responses from patterns in data. You can see that the level medium is a little bit more verbose, of course, and you can see that the level high is even more verbose, and it just likes talking a bit more. I suppose that, I mean, of course, this one's going to be the more expensive one because it is necessarily giving you more tokens. But yeah, this is a new setting that you now have available, and it's under the text parameter with the verbosity setting right here, okay? Now, that's for verbosity, and something to keep in mind is that the reasoning is still set to medium by default. as you can see, even if you add 4 extra verbosity. So verbosity does not control the reasoning effort at all. That is, however, another um, parameter that you can modify. All right, another setting that we have is the reasoning effort. And now previously with the other reasoning models that we had O3, O4, we had low, medium, and high for the reasoning effort. Now, since GPT-5 is always a thinking model, they have also added a minimal reasoning setting, which I kind of understand that this should be used instead of the non-thinking models, okay? And of course, this one is the one that has the lowest latency. Here I just give you a few examples. So I just tested this with minimal, low, and medium and high effort. And I asked the same question 4 different times with different efforts. So the first one, it answered, the question is, of course, are you conscious? The first time it answered, no, I don't have consciousness, blah, blah, blah. The second one, same thing. Third one, fourth time, you can take a look at the actual answers if you want to zoom in. But something interesting right here is that it doesn't matter how much it thought about it. This actually does not seem to influence the verbosity, okay? Like you can think about something for a long time. That does not necessarily going to mean that your answer is going to be more verbose. So just consider that. Something to keep in mind, however, is that the more and the higher the effort, the more thinking tokens that it is going to produce. And of course, thinking tokens are going to be built as regular output tokens. So here I am actually printing the actual summaries of the chain of thought or the thinking tokens that it generated, because remember that we do not have access to the actual thinking tokens, to the actual chain of thought. And that's most likely for security purposes, as we're going to see in just a moment. But we do have access to the summary of it. So as we can see, on their minimal reasoning effort, it produced no summary, so arguably no thinking happened. Same thing on low. On medium, we have one summary, which says discussing consciousness. I don't have beliefs, desires, or self-awareness, etc. Something interesting right here is that when I set it to high, it went over 3 different loops of reasoning. So it went about this problem 3 different times and produced 3 different chains of thought, and produced those 3 different summaries. So that's something interesting to keep in mind. And this one, of course, is going to be the most expensive one. It was definitely the one that took the longest to generate a completion. So that's for the reasoning effort. Now let's take a look at something very, very important, which is that you should probably now always be using the Stateful API. So what do I mean when I say that you should probably now be using the Stateful API? OpenAI actually has 2 different APIs now for accessing their language models. So they have the regular chat completion interface, which receives messages as you usually would. So it receives a chain of messages, so it will receive the entire history of your conversation. The responses API, instead, it does not take as input a chain of messages. It takes just the text as input. Going back to the first interface that we had in these APIs, kind of interesting, just to keep in mind, something to keep in mind. But something very interesting about the Responses API, and the reason why you should probably use this one pretty much always when using GPT-5, is that remember that GPT-5 is always a thinking model, and that means that it's going to be almost always generating thinking tokens. And something important as well is that those tokens, as we saw before, right here, you never see them. You never see those thinking tokens. So if you use the Chat Completions API, it is stateless. You're going to get the responses from your LLM, and then you're going to send back the final responses, but you're not going to be able to send back the chain of thought tokens, right? That is not the case with the Responses API, because if you use the Responses API, you can ask a first question and then ask a second question with the previous response ID as parameter right here. And that means that it's going to keep track of the conversation by itself. And that also means that this one right here is going to consider the chain of thought tokens from this previous query. Okay, so you probably now want to start using the Responses API instead of the Chat Completions API for for GPT-5, precisely because of this. Otherwise, you're going to be spending more money trying to regenerate those thinking tokens every single time. So something to keep in mind. Just to show you how this works actually within the notebook right here. Here, I just went on and asked OpenAI GPT-5, are you conscious with minimal effort? It said no, as we have seen before. I checked the response ID and I used it as parameter in the previous response ID right here. And this time I asked a follow-up question so that it has my context of the previous question that I asked, which is this one right here. And I was like, how are you so sure about it? Think about it thoroughly, okay? So here, remember that we mentioned at the beginning that if you prompt GPT-5 to think about something thoroughly, it's going to think more about it. And it's going to use more reasoning tokens for it. And I also manually set the effort to high. So this is something important because OpenAI actually mentioned that this setting right here is only updating the system prompt level of this setting. So yeah, just keep that in mind. This is not something like temperature or like top K or something like that. This is actually just changing the system prompt. And then I asked for the summary. So it thought about it for a while and it answered a very thorough response, of course. Short answer, I can't have absolute metaphysical certainty about anything, etc., blah, blah, blah. But something interesting to keep in mind is that it actually thought for 6 different rounds. So it went on the first time exploring consciousness in LLMs, second time it thought about structuring the consciousness argument, then analyzing consciousness perspectives, clarifying LLM capabilities, examining machine consciousness again. So there you go. I mean, he thought about it way more than even just by setting the reasoning level to high, which in the last time it yielded a three rounds of thinking. In this case, 6 rounds of thinking, because we did both effort high and also prompted it to think thoroughly about it. So something to keep in mind. And there you go. This is basically the main changes that you have in the API. I do think that these are things that are probably going to become more ubiquitous in the competitors. Hopefully, only once this becomes more transparent, but I do think that this is going to become a standard precisely because of the pricing part. They're definitely going to be saving a lot of money by routing a lot of easy answers to the simple models. So there you go. Let's take a quick look at the security aspect of this. This is actually also very, very interesting because it's dealt in a different way. We have different system and developer prompts, and we have different ways to guardrail this system. So let's take a look at that. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the security aspect of this. And this is very, very interesting because they are doing some very novel things right here. We know that in the past they have published this article that we see right here called Detecting Misbehavior in Frontier Reasoning Models. And what they do is they're going to analyze the chain of thought of your model as it is thinking of what to answer to you. And depending on that chain of thought, they're going to decide whether or not they give you the answer or not. Okay, so that's basically what's going on. And that's probably also the reason why they don't give you the actual tokens of the chain of thought. What they give you is just the summary, as we saw just a moment ago. And that's very interesting to consider because, of course, this adds to the security layer. And something very interesting about this is that they have actually a classifier that is going to classify whether or not the chain of thought is about biology. And it is going to be treated differently if it is about biology, okay? I don't know what they found or what deals they made with the government or whoever, but they are apparently, as you probably saw in the presentation, they're quite interested in protecting against dangerous material related to biological weapons or biological harm. So as you can see right here, instead, they have developed a two-tier system of real-time automated oversight surrounding the model to monitor and block unsafe prompts and generations. So there's a two-tier system. The first tier in the system is a very fast classifier that determines whether or not the content of your query and the answer is related to biology, okay? If it is related to biology, then it is going to go to the second tier right here, which is going to monitor the reasoning model to determine whether or not there is any danger in what is being generated and what it can actually respond to you. So as you can see, they're taking this very, very seriously while always monitoring the chain of thought, because remember that GPT-5 is always a reasoning model. And something also very interesting about this is that they are going to be monitoring every single generation, even for zero data retention people. So, as they say right here, for API customers with whom we have executed a zero data retention agreement, while we do not retain generations, we do screen them for potentially harmful information related to biological and chemical risk, and can take action when such generations are detected. Just keep that in mind. I mean, every single generation from the API is going to be monitored through the chain of thought, even though apparently they do not save them, but everything is monitored. I don't know what they saw. I do not know with whom they are dealing or what they seem to see it capable of doing, but they're taking health risks very, very seriously. And lastly, also covering on the security side, this is actually something that's going to be quite interesting to you if you're building this kind of applications. They have added a third layer to the system prompt system that we usually have. So in general, when you would do your applications, you have the system prompt, which is the prompt defined by the developer, by the builder of the application, which describes what the agent is supposed to do, what it is supposed to behave like, and the objectives, etc. And then you have the messages from the users. Well, now we have three levels right here. We have the system prompt, which is actually written on top of everything in the API, so you cannot change that. That is the system prompt set by AI, and it's always going to be passed into the model. Secondly, you have the developer messages, which come right after, which is going to be the one that you have access to and that you're going to be able to update. So here in the developer message is where you're going to add whether or not it is supposed to take certain personality, what it's supposed to do, its objectives, etc. And then in the end, you have the user messages. And they have apparently trained it to be very, very strict about this. So the instructions mentioned in the system message trump any instruction in the developer message, and the developer message trumps any instruction in the user message, which of course seems to make this way more secure and harder to jailbreak, okay? So you can build more secure applications. And there you go. That was basically everything that we have about ChatGPT and GPT-5. Do feel free to take a look at the notebook and let me know what you think about it. The API is changing quite a bit. I hope that you have the main changes right here in this video and that was useful to you. Thank you very much for watching, and let me know what you think about GPT-5 here in the comments or in the community as well. Glad to see you all discuss about this. So, with any further ado, have a good one.